Hi, everybody. I'm Bryan Norcross, along with Luke Dorris. This is podcast number 15 of Hurricane Season 2021 and podcast number 71 in our series. So, Luke, things have really shut down in the tropics, almost like a switch was thrown.
And who would have thought so after the blitz that we had? It was just name after name after name. I mean, third most active season on record, and poof, it's gone. So at least for now, I shouldn't say it's gone. It's on a big pause.
Yeah, big pause. But I still, we talked about this last week, and to me, it's more than just the MJO. It's something. I mean, to me, this is a real open question about how the switch was thrown quite so dramatically. But you know what? The models actually got it, right? They saw that it was going to go quiet, and indeed it did.
It takes us back to some of our discussions about the AMO, that we've had here not so long ago. Is that a potential factor? Is it real? Is it not real? If it's real, did it play a role here? I mean, that's more of a seasonal thing than probably an intra-seasonal, but still, who knows? It's just interesting.
It feels like there had to be multiple things going on. But in any case, today we're going to talk with Jim Carrier, who's a prolific author and filmmaker. He's written on many subjects ranging from civil rights to the American West to the surprisingly seedy underbelly of the shrimp industry and so much more. But he's written a gripping book. He wrote this a few years ago, actually, called The Ship and the Storm, about the loss of the cruising vessel, the Fantome, as it became trapped in the heart of epically fierce Hurricane Mitch. The ship has an amazing past, and there's a Miami connection. The ship was owned by Windjammer Barefoot Cruises, which was based in the Sunset Harbor neighborhood in Miami Beach. It seemed appropriate to have Jim on today as we're approaching the 23rd anniversary of the loss of the Fantome. It's thought to have gone down on October 27th, 1998. It's a stunning tragedy. It's just a storm for the ages that we don't think about when we think of the great hurricanes of modern time. And we're going to talk with Jim about the Fantome and about Mitch here coming up in just a few minutes. We're recording this podcast on Wednesday, October 20th, 2021. If you're listening at some point in the future for the latest weather in South Florida, of course, tune into Channel 10. Or if you're anywhere, you can tune into local10.com, where we have the Local 10 newscasts on live, and they're free, and you can get them anywhere you are. The Max Tracker Hurricane app on your phone will give you the latest tropical information, although there is no tropical information right now, and the Local 10 Weather Authority app. And if you go to local10.com/hurricane, you can sign up for a newsletter that I write whenever there's something going on. It's kind of been nice to have a few days off here because I hadn't had any days off in a long time from writing that. But in any case, if you sign up, we'll email it to you and you'll get it anytime there's anything going on in the tropics. So I guess the big question, Luke, is are we done with hurricane season? I mean, the MJO, which is this kind of wave that goes around the earth and it either suppresses activity in general or peaks activity in general, enhances it, is supposed to come around to the Atlantic at the very end of October. But by the very end of October, waters are getting cooler and weather patterns generally become less conducive. So I don't know. We can't say, I guess, is the bottom line, right?
Yeah, we don't know. I mean, it's so settled out there now, but we are seeing these fronts that drive down, and we can get some showers and disturbed weather that can spill over the warm waters of the Caribbean. Probably something subtropical, at least you would think, could try to get going before the season's done. All that we have left is Wanda. That's the only name that's left. But I don't know. We'll just have to see.
Yeah, the way that system that formed eventually. Remember, we had all these 30% possibilities of some kind of tropical system, and it ended up that this tropical disturbance got mixed up in with that super strong dip in the jet stream, and it formed a non-tropical low east of the Bahamas. We have these big, intense, sharp troughs or dips in the jet stream that are moving through. And they tend to spin up some sort of a low pressure system just because of the dynamics of the atmosphere. That kind of thing can still happen, and we still can get a subtropical storm out of that, but it doesn't feel conducive to having a kind of traditional Caribbean hurricane with the jet stream dipping so far south this time of year.
Well, yeah, that's the thing. We have the subtropical jet. The polar jet's further north, but the
Right.
subtropical jet, it seems like it just keeps screaming right across the Gulf of Mexico and Florida. So I had a guy that came to me yesterday that works at the station. He said, "Can I take my shutters down?" I'm like, "Man, it doesn't look like anything could make it up here, even if something else were to form further south." So it just feels like, as far as a big, impactful event to Florida, odds seem exceptionally low at this
Yeah,
point. Would you agree with that?
unlikely would be a way to describe it, but we certainly have a history of late October storms. So you just hate to say absolutely not
Sure.
at this point. And La Nina has formed finally, but maybe too little, too late. I mean, that's normally enhances hurricane activity, makes the atmosphere in the tropics more conducive to development. And it's real now, finally.
Yeah,
But it's not what it was last year. It's not as strong as it was last year. And it seems like the weather pattern is counteracting all of that.
and it got a label, right? But has the atmosphere really changed much over the past 2 months? Because the ocean temperatures have to be above a certain threshold for such a stretch of time before we can say La Nina is here. So, because there's a delay in the response to the atmosphere from the warming of the ocean.
Or
So
the
I
cooling
get
of
that.
the ocean in this case.
Excuse me, the cooling of the ocean, yes.
Right.
But so it got a label finally, but has much really changed now versus a month ago when things were ripping?
Well, and
Because
also just wintertime weather patterns are we feel wintertime type weather dipping farther south already. So anyway, it's all very interesting, and I'm sure people will be talking about this for a long, long time. All right, so let me turn things over to Luke now, who arranged for today's guest to be with us.
Okay, so let's bring in Jim Carrier. He's author of The Ship and the Storm. Hello, Jim. Welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks, Luke. Brian, good to be with you.
It's good to have you. So you've written on a wide array of topics, everything from civil rights to even the Marlboro Man. And I love Americana, so I have to hear about this before we get to hurricanes. Tell me a little bit about that. How did you get involved with the Marlboro Man, and what did you learn there?
Well, basically, I'm from upstate New York and grew up with cowboys on television and the radio, even the radio before that, and then eventually the Associated Press sent me west to South Dakota, which I thought was, like the Wild West for me. I went out there in my three-piece suit and ultimately realized that. Cowboy boots were more in. But anyway, while I was out in the West and I had some great assignments, I ran a paper in Rapid City and then eventually went to the Denver Post and had this great job where I roamed around and I was called the Rocky Mountain Ranger. I had actually had my name on the door of the car and the Jeep. And I would hear stories about Marlboro ads being shot at various ranches or various venues. And of course, I'd grown up really with them. I mean, the Marlboro started as a man's brand in 1955 and really they settled on the cowboy thing in 1963. So, I'd seen them all my life. And when I would try to get in through Philip Morris to do a story about them, they would say, no, we won't allow you in. Well, that just piqued my interest. And I had this great job where I could roam around and pretty much do what I wanted. And so I decided that I would spend some time, and I spent probably half a year through investigative reporting, and it was fairly lighthearted. It was looking at the whole cowboy thing. I went and I found I wanted to find the guys on the billboards. That was really what it was all about, because they really started using real cowboys in the mid 60s. Before that was just models. And so I find one and then find another, and, I'd find a photographer and they'd give me a hint and whatnot thing. And in fact, this is a funny little story. I'm trying to write a book about all of this because I was down in Texas at a place where they actually steamed the hats so that the guy could make almost anybody look like the same guy, Marlboro Man. And I was just talking to him, and he said, "Oh yeah, so and so here. He wears a 7 1/8 or whatever." And I would. He went over to a little paper file cabinet, and he opened it up, and he started looking through, and here were the names were all the Marlboro models. It was like finding gold. So suddenly I had the whole list of the guys, and I chased them down, those that would talk to me, and talked to a lot of photographers and roamed around. And meanwhile, sort of compared the Marlboro Man with, um, you know, cowboys generally. And the guys who ultimately were the key models were, in fact, true cowboys and wonderful writers and wonderful guys, great Westerners. So it was a fun series.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And you see these ads, and the whole point is, hey, you can be like this guy, and everybody sees a picture of that man and thinks that's the guy I want to be. I want to be that tough, ruggedly handsome guy out on in the mountains. And if you smoke Marlboro cigarettes, you can be that guy. I mean, it's an interesting trick that gets played on people, and
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
it's
It's I've in some of my investigations since I realized that the story, of course, is that the cowboys sold Marlboro, and the guys who study this thing say they don't know of anybody who maybe specifically smoked because of Marlboro, or
mhm.
might took their first cigarette, but they would. They said it certainly, portrayed it as it 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 it, it basically supported the idea of smoking this brand. But anyway, it was the most successful advertising history, campaign in history, and it did have a kind of a not kind of it had a really bad ultimately legacy. Besides the cowboy, it killed probably. Yeah, one study said 3 million people died in the first 50 years just smoking Marlboro. So
Wow.
and I didn't even get into that in my original series, but now I'm going to do that in the book. So
Yeah, a lot to get in there. So, of all your writing, the most prevalent themes seem to center around nature and your admiration for the world around you. It comes through so beautifully in your writing. It really captivates you in The Ship in the Storm, the book that we'll talk about today. I mean, you even get a sense of the smell in the air. It's amazing. So, I imagine that admiration came naturally from your adventures out west in the Jeep and sailing around the ocean. So, did you seek these places out to write about, or did the job take you there and the inspiration came second?
I would say that as a reporter, and I've lived a lot of different places, I work with found materials, what's around me. And uh, that's what a reporter does. You look around and you say, oh, that's interesting. What's there? And I grew up on a farm in upstate New York. So I was outdoors and in the Adirondacks and all of that. So I took naturally, I think, or kind of, yeah, naturally to being outdoors. And then, of course, this great job of roaming around. And I spent almost a year in Yellowstone doing a series. I went from the top to the bottom of the Colorado River. Um, I tried to do I lived with a ranch family. I lived with an Indian family. But yeah, nature was something. And I wasn't, I enjoyed science. I liked science. But I learned as I went, and of course that's what reporters do. You find an expert and interview them and then suddenly you're the expert, at least for a day.
Yeah.
and so yeah, and I had the opportunity. And I think one thing you did mention, and I used to be an editor as well. Detail is what's important. I mean, Hemingway said you find the detail that expresses the emotion, and then you throw the rest of it away. But you find the right detail that expresses the emotion. So yeah, I mean, you're reading something, and you need to make that come alive in all the senses. And I think that's just good writing.
That's being a good reporter, exactly. Yes. So, how did you come to write about the Fantome? It sounds like you didn't really have a connection so much to the ship or Hurricane Mitch. It was the story, no doubt.
Well, in a way, it was found. I was living on my boat. When I left the Denver Post in '98, I moved. I bought a boat and on the East Coast and moved it down to the Florida Keys. And I was
Wow.
down there that summer, and we had gone through Hurricane George, which is a Cat 1 storm. It came right over Key West,
Right.
and I was anchored out in the Seaplane Basin down there, and um, took all those precautions, and I spent it on shore, and then we thought, essentially hurricane season was over,
Hmm.
and suddenly here comes this storm coming through, tropical storm when it came back to life, and roared over, killed a couple people in Florida, and really kind of the remnants of it went all the way to Iceland before it kind of petered out or died.
Yeah, this
But
was the loop it made. It was Mitch made this very unusual, bizarre loop. I worked that storm. I was on TV in
yeah,
Miami covering it. I
so
remember that well.
the Miami Herald had a piece about the missing boat. I think at
Hmm.
that point it was just still missing, probably within a week
Right.
of its disappearance, which was what 26 years ago, on the 27th, and they were still hopeful. And so I was freelancing for the New York Times at the time, and I said to them, "Would you like a piece?" And they did, and they did a big, almost a full page on this missing. And the time, because I was writing for the Times, the company and a lot of other people were willing to talk to me, and I was able to do that. And from that, got a book contract through the book company, and by that time I had taken my boat up to Alabama, and I got a chance to sit and write for a year and a half. But anyway, that's we can talk more about
Well,
how
it
I
is an
did it.
amazing story, which we are going to talk about now. Then, and the ship's owner, Mike Burke, was
Yeah.
this fascinating guy with this connection to Miami and South Florida. Of course, I remember the castle, his house on Miami Beach was kind of famous. I lived relatively close to that, as a matter of fact. It was just a fascination for people, and it had a moat that was filled with live sharks. And then he was this aggressive business guy who built Windjammer cruises, just practically out of nothing. So tell us about the early days of the company and the crazy cruises they offered. And Mike Burke was just a wild time.
Mike was he was born in New Jersey, and and ultimately found his way after World War II in Miami, and bought an old sailboat, started poking around, and then started inviting friends to come and sail to the Bahamas. And eventually he asked them to maybe chip in to pay for food or drink or whatever. And I'm sure there was plenty of drink. He was single at the time, and a lot of women went with him, and sometimes only women or a woman. And eventually he decided, hey, maybe I could actually make a living out of this. And so he bought a little bit bigger boat, and a little bit bigger boat, and eventually opened this idea. And he had this classism, I'd say, view that normal cruise ships that we think of, the Princess lines and all of that, were, he used to call them frou-frou ships.
Hmm.
And he was going to do something. In a way, it was the only thing he could afford to do, which was basically do it on the cheap.
Hmm.
And he would put together these old boats. He would rip out the interior, and put in cheap cabins, and for a while he was able to sail from Miami over to the Bahamas or Bermuda. No, I don't think he went to Bermuda, but down into the islands a little bit. And it just kind of grew, and he had this idea that people, it was called barefoot because that's what you did. You were barefoot. And the captain's dinner, as they always say, you could wear a T-shirt.
Yeah. So it was Windjammer Barefoot Cruises, right? Was the
That's right.
company.
Cruise
Yeah.
line.
Cruise line, right.
And he operated there in Miami, and he advertised and got a lot of publicity to give reporters. New York Times, lots of famous writers went with him, and he had frankly incredibly bawdy sales, a lot of gay sales, cruises for the LGBTQ crowd, and you know, and then he would get publicity about that, and that was just add to it. So it wasn't a family operation, I would say, basically in the early days. It was, but he always had good food. He had plenty to drink, and they always had a good time. And when you talk to the captains and people who worked for him in those days, they laugh and they said, everything always was breaking down. I mean, it was the toilets would back up, or the sails would rip, or they would go over to the Bahamas, and one time they took whatever boat it was, maybe it was the Fantome, and they came too close to the dock, and the forepeak just kind of raked all the lamps off the waterfront there. So he was, and he frankly he sailed outside of the rules. He would never have. I think the Coast Guard got along with him for a while, but eventually decided that ruled that he couldn't sail out of Miami, and so he went offshore, and he would pick it up. I mean, people he would fly
ferry the people out to the ship somehow.
Well, I think they would fly them over. They would say, "Okay, meet us over here on this island," wherever. Eventually, he was down into the Caribbean, but
I see.
Yeah. So he always, one of the things I talk about a lot in the book was the idea that, under Solus, and this was not much of a history I didn't know much about, but, it was the Titanic that created the rules that any ship that's carrying passengers has to be equipped in such a way that that if it sinks level. That is right.
Mm-hmm.
And so
it doesn't go down at an angle. In other words,
right,
bow first, like the Titanic. Yes.
Right. Exactly. And the idea is you have bulkheads and water compartments and other things like that. And the idea was so then the crew and the passengers could have time to get to the lifeboats and get down and get off and live. And that was the whole idea. Well, he didn't do any of that. The Fantome itself, which we can talk about as a great ship, had a storied history. But even before that, every ship he had, every boat he had, and he just got bigger and bigger. And the Fantome eventually became sort of the queen of the fleet. Was put together, was cobbled together, really. But people loved it. That was the most amazing thing. People loved it. They loved the atmosphere. Even if things that went wrong, they would help out. If the motor quit, and somehow, the angels were looking for Mike for a long, long, long time, and he built, really a multi-million-dollar company on that whole atmosphere.
Well, Miami has a long history of eccentric people doing amazing things that skirt the rules and so forth. He was just in that category of a Miami guy. And the ship, as you said, was almost as interesting as he was. I mean, it had a wild history before it ended up being purchased by Windjammer. To talk about the story of the ship, where it came from before it ended up being part of the Windjammer fleet.
Well, the Duke of Westminster actually had it made in Italy, and it was really one of the last great boats from the age of sail.
Like in the 20s, right? It was a...
Yeah, I think 27, if I recall.
27 sticks in my mind. Yeah.
Yeah, and it was made in Italy and put inside essentially a steel hull. In fact, he took an old, essentially the guts of an old windjammer or a schooner, and put it inside of a steel hull, and then put it up and down the Mediterranean. And it had 6 suites. This is a boat that's as long as a football field, 300 feet, and it has 4 masts, and they were 100 feet tall too, and they were, it was luxurious.
So this is a big boat. I mean, this is not any kind of small
Huge,
right? This is a huge yacht.
huge boat.
Yes.
It had a
Yes.
couple of big diesel engines, very heavy, and had 6 suites. So the Duke had his footman and a staff of 50 or something, and they would put her up and down. And at some point, he actually had it sailed. Now, he didn't do it, but he had his crew take it over to Seattle, or probably Vancouver, for some thing having to do with Canada and maybe the whole Britannica thing. And then World War II came along, and it was stuck there. And eventually he got rid of it, and it went through a whole series of ownerships. Eventually went back to the Med. Very rich guys would buy it, and eventually it found itself basically half sinking in Kiel in Germany, in the canal there. And well, for a time, Onassis owned it. The rumor was, and this was one of these stories that Mike Burkwood made up, that he was, Onassis was going to give it to
Jackie?
to Jackie. That's right,
Yeah.
for a wedding present. And
So I remember pictures of Aristotle Onassis and Jackie Kennedy Onassis on a ship. Did they ever meet up? Was that just some other ship? Obviously, he was a shipping magnate. So
yeah, no, he never took possession of it, actually.
Okay.
I mean, he like, Onassis, like Burke, would peddle boats back and forth that they never saw. I mean, they were in that business. Both of them, I think, got their start, using old World War II troop ships and things like that. So, excuse me. So there's the boat sitting in the Kiel Canal in Germany, and I think maybe Onassis, I forget who it was, but he made it. Mike Burke learned of it, and he went over there and hired a bunch of guys to bring it across the Atlantic. And that's a story in and of itself. I mean, he basically took this, and if you look at pictures in the book of of the original suite, then they had cabins that looked like the cottages of Cotswold. That's I mean, and furniture was sized to match what was on some of these mansions, and our beautiful archways and beautiful woodwork and cap rails and just the best of everything. And I think the crew, there were probably, at any time, maybe 16 guests, and then a crew of maybe 50. So Mike took all of that as the guys were, this is his order, as they crossed the Atlantic, they basically tore all that out and threw it overboard. And I described the boat in the end as basically a Motel 6 with a bar. He built a bunch of cheap cabins, plywood cabins, and built a deck up above with a bar, and took the main salon and turned that into the dining room, and then started selling accommodations, and that was his flagship. And again, the guys who sailed it for Mike Burke to a man, said it sailed like a pig. It was so much windage, and it didn't wasn't properly set up to sail. It was they used what's called staysails, which were the triangular sails they would use for show, but basically they motored around. And people were they had one of their rituals on these these boats was the crew would get out there, and we'll talk about the crew in a minute, but the crew would get out there and raise the sails, as they start to going, and they would play Amazing Grace, and people would cry, and they'd get out and take a hold of the rope and, raise it with them, and it became this ritual that, to this day, I think some jammers, as they're called, will tear up at the sound of that music.
Yeah, you read the book, and there are so many people that are extremely fond of Windjammer cruises. I mean, it must have just been an incredible experience to be on something like the Fantome. And it's really a shame, too. You hear about the boat and how ornate and what a masterpiece it would have been. And to just chuck stuff off the side, it fits with Burke and his wild past. But, speaking of the Fantome, once Windjammer takes ownership of it, over the years, it seems like it gets cut on quite a lot. I mean, some pretty major structural changes happen over time. But Mike Burke and his son later defend the integrity of the ship. They say that they improved its safety. They put in the watertight bulkheads and other advancements. But then there were other reports that the ship was a disaster waiting to happen. So if you piece all this together with your research, where do you land on how safe the ship actually was as we got to 1998?
Well, the bottom line is it was never inspected by Lloyd's of London or any reliable agency that would actually look at it. Secondly, it could never pass a Coast Guard test because of that. I mean, take something very simple. I mean, these little plywood cabins that they had. I mean, you're not allowed to have plywood cabin walls. I mean, on a Solus. And I should go back and say, what happened after the Titanic was the creation of the safety of life at sea. It means SOLAS, SOLAS, and it's administered by the arm of the United Nations, International Maritime Association, and it basically sets rules for how boats, and it has minimum standards. And if you're a member of the United Nations and boats come to your country, they should meet certain standards. And what happens in the United States is the Coast Guard will go out with those standards in mind and inspect it. And they have a right to do that if they even just stop and pick up people. And Mike could not, he never did it. He says he didn't have the money. And so he would, so he would sail offshore. Now, what you have to have to get a certificate, so-called, is a flagged company, a flagged country. This particular boat, and this is very common in the cruise business, every ship is flagged separately for insurance and loss purposes. But this particular boat was flagged in Equatorial Guinea. Now, tell me if you even know where it is, but does it have a port? Does it have any kind of maritime history? It didn't. It doesn't. But there was a guy in Florida who was their agent, and he would sign off that yes, it met SOLAS standards, and the crew, and he would then, for I forget what the figure was, $100 or something, he would write tickets for the crew that they were in fact SOLAS certified. Well, there was no test, there was no inspections, no nothing. And the most grievous thing, I think, in my research was finding out that in order to remodel the ship which they did in Trinidad, the original boat was built with these two huge I-beams that went from stem to stern, and it went the full length. They cut those and in order to put a stairway in that went sideways so that you didn't hit your head. In fact, I quote the captain who was on at the time, and he said, "All right, I'll do it," but he left the beam in, and it would meant that people would actually hit their head as they were going down the stairs. So they cut it off. Mike Burke Jr., Michael, was. By the way, Mike Burke is the name that Mike, the old captain, took. It wasn't his real name, but eventually the family were called the Burkes. Michael agreed with that. It was basically to make it easier to go up and down the stairs. And that, I think, was in the end a fatal mistake. Because when you get to the end and you do the forensics on what this boat was facing in the eye wall of Hurricane Mitch, you can't imagine what it was going through. As big as it was, the tumult of the sea at that time would at times create waves, square waves that that would, make the ship maybe teetering on two sides, and it could. There's lots of speculation as to what happened, but ultimately it probably broke in half or somehow turtled, it turned upside down, and sank very, very rapidly. And that's based on what little is found, was found later. I mean, no EPIRB went off. No, there were maybe 2 life rafts that were found empty. There was 1 life jacket that belonged to a crewman he was actually a part of the hotel staff. So I come down on the idea that I'll take a diversion here right now and mention that one of the big key factors that was debated over and over on this was what they should have done when they were finally cornered by the hurricane. And this goes back to a disaster that happened in the U.S. Navy called Halsey's Typhoon, in which the ultimate decision or the ultimate lesson was that you leave port instead of staying in port, because if the hurricane comes down, your ship will get bashed. Well, but there are a lot of provisos involved with that, and one is that the boat is seaworthy, right? That it actually can go to sea, go fast enough to beat, the storm to the crossing, and then deal with the conditions that it would face. And that's where this go to sea stuff failed with the Fantome, because it was incapable. One of the last, we'll talk about it in a minute probably, but when they went down to hide and sail back and forth in the lee of Roatan, the island off of Honduras, part of the Bay Islands, there was a point where the captain, the young guy in March, told Michael Burke that he could no longer tack because the wind was coming from the north and he couldn't tack through it. He didn't have the power, and there was so much windage that so then he was doomed to go on east and ultimately made his fate.
Mm. Yeah, a lot of problems with that boat being near a hurricane for sure. And you mentioned it sails like a pig, and that got him. So, something that comes through in the book a lot is the crew. And by all accounts, these are people that are very charismatic. They seem well suited to life aboard a cruise vessel, and they're just loaded with character. But they don't have U.S. certifications, much like the boat. All right. So how well trained were these people? They were capable. They were eager. I know that they could live a relatively good life with the wages that would be provided by them through the cruise industry, and some of the instances of them, fabbing up repair on the boat is really pretty remarkable. But whenever it comes to some catastrophe that may be happening at sea, how capable do you think that and trained were the people in that instance?
Well, I mean, Guy on March had a Pac 6, basically. He was English. He had gone through a very rigorous course in England and got his yacht masters, I guess it is, which basically licensed him to carry 6 passengers. Well, there were 97 passengers on this boat, and but he was a really good sailor. The other guys, one of the fellows, his deputies, had gone but had not finished the New York Maritime School, New York University, New York State University Maritime School. Um, the rest of the guys were all from the islands and were basically taught on the job. And they weren't particularly mariners. I mean, I don't think they even had boats that they grew up on. Um, a lot of the crew was from Guyana. They were there because that was the best they could do, and money. It was more money than they could get in their own poor country. Um, but they made up for all of that, and some of these guys were. They kind of remind me of the guys in Cuba who keep the old 55 Chevys going, even without parts. They were able to fashion the parts on these boats, uh, with a welding torch and a file and some coat hangers and kept the thing going, and they did. They were beautiful men. I mean, literally beautiful men, and they were. It's very well known, and it's the women who were crew on that boat talked about it. They had they were lovers. They had children together. A lot of these men had families everywhere, or several places. Um, but to get to your basic question, no, they did not have any kind of certification except for that one that guy in Miami signed. That your ticket that you're capable of handling this boat in this size boat and it's SOLAS qualified. So no, they were not, but they were, for the most part. Mike Burke got away with this for 50 years by hiding. He didn't face a real hurricane. Down in the Caribbean, you had as you well know, a lot of warning usually when these hurricanes come, thanks to the National Hurricane Center. And you can hide, that is, you can maneuver the boat into the lee, downwind, from the hurricane and watch it. And if the hurricane did as predicted, you can kind of go around the island as the hurricane moves past. And that's what they did. And so, they wouldn't go and anchor and, huddle down and let people off. They would keep the cruise going. It became part of the adventure. And they got away with it. And I mean, I've done it myself. One year, 95, I think it was, I sailed, I took a yacht and went from Grenada, and I was supposed to go all the way to Haiti, I think, and we ended up with four hurricanes all at once that year. You probably remember that year. It was
Yeah, it was a busy year. 95 was a very busy year.
I was every time I'd get going, the company would call and say, hide. So, and it wrecked a lot of places. It got wrecked. But so I'm familiar with that strategy, and Mike got away with it for a long time. And in this case, because of the really erratic, and you guys know more than I do about this, but the erratic movement of this hurricane caught them, and this idea of sailing back and forth in the lee of the Bay Islands, which are essentially the top of a mountain range. That's essentially what they look like, and they are, because once you get away, it's like 4,000 feet deep. It didn't work.
Yeah. Well, we'll talk about the forecast for Mitch, because it was a very bizarre storm. I mean, like I said, I worked that every day that it was going on, and And we really were shocked by what happened. But that idea of hiding, I mean, that goes back to Christopher Columbus, right? The first
Right.
European to encounter a hurricane. What did he do? He saved his fleet by going hiding in Hispaniola because he recognized it. Exactly. That's what mariners do. So you talked about the crew, and it sounds like you really kind of got to know the crew and the passengers through this process, but they came from everywhere from England to Guyana to all over the place. What was that process like? And did you end up feeling like quite close to these people after you met so many family members and talked to their friends?
Well, number one, I never was on the boat. I've never done that. But I felt I was on the boat because of jammers, the crew, these people who are nuts. I dedicated my book to the men of the Fantome. And I said, there, but for the grace of God go I. Because I had been, I had been through or on the edges of enough hurricanes that I knew they were dangerous. The thing, the most amazing part about pulling this story together was the ability of not just memories, but videos. Remember how the Titanic movie opens with, suddenly it's in the depths of the ocean and then it comes up and then suddenly, the camera moves to the corroded old bowsprit and then suddenly there's, the full ship. That's how I felt with this. I felt like I was, because people had, I hate them when I'm on vacation, but people walked around with cameras in their eyes, and they were, over here, here's this. Oh, look at here, wait, here's the stairway. Well, I walked through the Fantome, through the films and the videos that these jammers did when they were on it, and so I was able to, and of course the descriptions, and they had pictures of these men, so. Yes, it was. I felt I knew the boat pretty well. We were able to reconstruct the layout of where the cabins were and all of that, how it was built. Michael Burke, to his credit, and Mike Burke, to his credit, talked to me about it. I didn't promise anything. They didn't get to see any, they didn't get to approve it or anything, but they did. I think because I'd written that piece in the New York Times, they felt that I was legitimate and would treat them fairly. And I tried to do that and to lay out all the possibilities about what happened and who was responsible and could have been avoided. But it was amazing to talk to these jammers and get their memories and their pictures and their videos and to recreate that boat. And there were enough guys and women who were on the cruise that was canceled that was like in real time. So they could tell me what the conditions were like. I mean, when they this was in Omoa, and then I went down a year later. Well, it was almost exactly a year later. And I went to the Bay Islands, and then looked for debris, and I found it, on the shore and sticking up on bars and stuff like that. And then I went over to the islands in Guyana and talked to the families, and it was on the first anniversary. I remember sitting in one mother's living room when this thing and his daughter, the crewman's daughter, was there, and she sees her father on television because it's the 1 year anniversary piece, right? And they're surrounded by all of these gifts that these men brought back to them in CDs and CD players and other gifts of them of one kind or another. And it was tough, frankly, to sit there and get them to try to remember what this person was like in life, right? The women who got evacuated with the passengers were very helpful too. They'd slept with these guys. They worked with them They knew them well. A lot of, I was able to bring them alive through the memories, very loving memories of the people that knew them best. And so, that was ultimately the real tragedy of all of this was, you know, it probably only took maybe half a dozen guys to run that boat. But they kept what they call the hotel crew on. That's the guys who did the cooking and, stewards and all of that. And some of them were walk-on guys from Honduras. They couldn't even get off the boat because they didn't have visas. They should never have been on that. I mean, that was a real tragedy, and that's why it was 31 men dead.
Yeah. So the book is about people to a large degree, but also you get into the meteorology of the hurricane. Did you have any interest in hurricanes before, and or any knowledge of hurricanes, or did you learn it as part of your reporting on the book? Because you're very detailed.
Well, I was living on my sailboat.
Yeah, well, that's true. Practical experience, right?
And I had gone through George and then just a few other hurricanes down there. But no, I was not. I didn't grow up on the coast or anything. The National Hurricane Center opened their doors to me, and I went down there. This is another hurricane you'll remember, Floyd.
Yes.
We landed. I landed. I had an appointment to go there and talk to the guys who worked the storm, worked Mitch, and we were the last plane into Miami when Floyd was blowing over.
Yeah, September 1999. Yes.
And so I then went out and spent a lot of time with them, and Lixion Avila, the Cuban forecaster, and his whole story about coming to the United States. And
yeah, we had Lixion on the podcast earlier this season. As a matter of fact, he just retired, although he's back with the Hurricane Center. He's still there. If you go to the Hurricane Center, you'll still encounter Lix.
As he got his initial foot in the door, although he had a PhD, and because he wouldn't sign on with Castro, he was not given a job in Cuba. But Miles Lawrence was one of the guys who worked that storm, and Richard Pash. Pash is still there.
Yeah, he still is.
And so I was able to stay there, not overnight, but I don't think, but a couple of long days, and see how they worked it. And then they were willing at that point, because they had already written the sort of the postmortem on that storm. And, we were able to walk through, and I mean, it was kind of, here you got this tragedy. At the same time, the guys of the National Hurricane Center out there in their, concrete bunker, not even aware of what's going on outside the door, weather-wise, with pinups. I called them the pinup storms, right? They've got these beautiful, and Mitch was a beautiful storm.
Yes, it was a huge storm. And that bunker, by the way, came about as a result of Hurricane Andrew.
You're right.
Right. So that's why they have the bunker out there in the western end of the FIU campus in West Dade.
And I found that whole thing fascinating. I wasn't particularly interested in weather per se, but the whole detail of how they actually put that thing together, and I think I described this, all the antennas and all the products that they have pouring into this room. Computers, and there's probably T1 lines and all kinds of other things coming from Colorado State and all kinds of other places. And then these guys sitting down and basically in an hour writing a forecast that's going to tell people what to do. And they were flummoxed by this storm. And one thing I learned about because you could, all that stuff is archived and you could read it.
Right. Mm-hmm.
They signaled very clearly, that is the forecasters, signaled very clearly They didn't know what was going on. And part of the reason was they didn't have many data points. There were not, a lot of things were broken. I think Puerto Rico's, I forget all the places that were not reporting balloons and all kinds of other things that they would normally use to forecast. Not that that would have made a difference, but Miles said and I just reread my book. He said, maybe I should have just said stationary, because the models just kept wanting to push it up toward the Yucatan and kept westward.
Right? We thought it was going into the Gulf.
Post-mortem,
Yes,
which
thought.
they had always, I don't know. I don't know if I remember this, but I don't know of any storm that moved quite like this one did and took a big left turn and then came down and sat on it. So yeah, that was all new to me and fascinating.
Yeah, we have a rule in hurricane forecasting that, slow moving, just developing, and a whole list of kinds of storms that you don't trust the forecast because small effects can make a big difference in a very slow moving storm, and that was really what the bottom line here is. The steering currents collapsed, so a slight effect that was undetectable at that time maybe would be undetectable today, directed the storm.
Yeah. The detail that I was able to get from what it was like inside the storm was pretty interesting, I thought. The way I was able to find it was, first of all, when I went to Guanaja, I was able to find people who had been through it, and watched lying on the ground. They got out of their homes and they would dig trenches just to lie on the ground because it was safer. And to watch, one guy talked about how he watched the mangroves. Mangroves are really tough old trees, right?
Yeah, they are.
The mangroves would just wear away to nothing. The wind and the blasted sea foam would just wear these to nothing. It was down to nothing. And then people who were stuck in homes and other, so almost hour by hour, I was able to sort of feel what it was like. And then Steve Lyons, who I think was
Sure.
he was with the Weather Channel. I went down to see him when he was still at the Weather Channel, and he had a wave model that he was able to put together, and so helped try to recreate. And then one of the most amazing stories about this whole thing, in terms of recreating, was that the hurricane hunters were flying into it, and they begged the guy who was head of the hurricane research outfit to let them in because they had never been in a Category 5 hurricane. And by the time they got there, it was starting to ease off, but still they learned a lot of things. And they call them the penetrators, and they count their penetrations, with the double entendre there of how many. And these guys have been in, and they were able to describe, and they have a belly radar on that airplane. And we went back and they pulled the tape, and we looked at it, and there is, almost at precisely the time, 4:30 on that afternoon, when the phone went dead, satellite phone went dead on the Fantome back to headquarters. They punched through on that eye wall and were able to see a blip in the water or below them that lasted for a while, looked like it was stationary, but who's to know? It was a brown blip, and but from that we were able then, and of course these guys have been in and out of hurricanes all the time, and they were able to describe in great detail what's going on in the eye wall. And that was total new science, and to me, this whole snowplow shoveling effect of water outside, and as it rotates, and then the maelstrom in the middle, and waves coming from all kinds of different directions. So yeah, I've I've been in some dicey times, but nothing like this with my own little boat. But and the worst thing is, and this is where your heart goes out to these guys, there was nothing they could do about it. I mean, they were underpowered. The sails were all ripped out by then. They were, probably going 40 degrees each side, back and forth on this big, huge boat. Um, the water's coming at them like a fire hose. Um, and the captain and his crew, lieutenants, were stuck in that little box that they had angle ironed onto the top of the front of the boat. And, oh God, those last few moments must have been terrible.
Yeah, I want to talk to you about that in a second, and that's the climax of the book, in a sense. But you really do a service to the meteorology in the way that you describe the physical processes. So that, and the people that put the forecast together, there's a large chunk of the book that includes both of those. So hats off to you there, and also another friend of the podcast, Max Mayfield. I know that you and he had crossed paths as well, and he and I have worked together, and Bryan has known him forever. So another one that you guys would have, again, crossed paths. So the decision for where the ship would go, this was guided by the forecast from the National Hurricane Center. But you highlight how these decisions were made kind of with an incomplete picture, as in Windjammer and Guy and March maybe didn't understand a lot of what you discussed, and that is the uncertainty and the interpretation of the forecast may have been misunderstood. And this is something we talk a lot about on this podcast, is communicating the forecast. If the people that get it misinterpret it, even if it's a perfect forecast, it's worthless. And I understand that you've taught on mass communication. So are there any lessons that you've lectured on that might apply to communicating a hurricane forecast in general that you think would work?
Well, in terms of forecasting, you mean? Or
yeah, just messaging in general with a hurricane threat.
Well, I think this storm and this disaster became a case study in tall ships, and really anybody who is anywhere in hurricane zones. And the lessons are numerous. For example, the discussion area under the National Hurricane that they put out with every forecast, which tells them what they know and what they don't know. They didn't have that on the boat. They couldn't get that, or I don't think. So they were unaware of that. So this was all I think Miami had it, but just the headquarters had it. But this isn't quite an answer to, but let me answer it this way, then I'll circle back around. I have often said, having been up close to a hurricane, that if Guy and March had not had a telephone to the headquarters, or any communication at all, he would have had to fall back on the age-old ancient idea of dealing with the storm. And when they were in Belize, it had dropped off the passengers, and they were sitting there in Belize, all you had to do was look east. And the thing is, 200 miles away, but the whole horizon is this big black bar. The people who flew away from the passengers said that. And you could stand there and, face the wind, which is coming from the north at that point, or northeast, and stick your arm out, and you'll find out where the center of the hurricane is.
Yeah, the rule of storms, right?
Right. And you look at that. In other words, there were some very simple, fundamental, ancient ways of thinking about this boat, or about this storm, and the position you're in, that if he had done that, he probably would not have tried to make this move and sneak it down back underneath these islands, which brought him 100 miles closer to a storm that was coming toward him. In terms of communication, I think one of the things you learned in this case study of this was that, and I know you guys hammer on this a lot, don't think of this as a straight line. You've got this track, and people think it's like a road through the forest. Well, it's not. It's this huge circle, and the longer you are away from that circle of uncertainty is even bigger. That was the lesson from World War II. And people had forgotten that. I think they came to rely on the expertise. One of the things that I was startled to learn as a sailor was how wrong they were. In that year, I printed this out, but that year when Mike did the reconstruction, they were 24-hour period was they were off by 80 miles. I mean, that's a lot, 80 miles. I mean, there was only 25 miles between from the Bay Islands and the mainland there. And I think, most of the GFDI, which was their favorite, but a day late, was 96 miles. So nothing did well in terms of interpreting that. But forget all of that. I mean, I think there was something about, there was, what I learned from that was if all you got is the wind in your face, and the fact is, if they had gone into a bar in Honduras and looked at the Weather Channel or whatever the channel is down there, it would have scared the hell out of them because the storm was huge. It was huge. And if you go back and again read the forecasts, the forecasts were accurate. By the time they started their cruise, there were supposed to be 12-foot seas and tropical storm winds in the Bay Islands. Well, it was ridiculous, the idea that they would actually start a cruise there. And so it's hard to, I couldn't be in their guys' minds. I mean, and I think we also know, and this was the case in the disaster of the Faro too, you get on a schedule, you got the company breathing down your back, you're going to lose money if you divert. And so you just keep going. When I sailed across the Atlantic, I came across one of those boats crossing our path there as I was headed to Bermuda, and he was pulling a big tug full of, 4 Jeeps or something. And he radioed me and I started talking to him. He says, "Oh, we're just bus drivers. We're just going back and forth every day to New Jersey, carrying these cars, and they've got a schedule." Well, the loss of the money, Mike Burke said this later, it really wasn't a factor. But, I think Guy on March, there was so much going on in his mind. He had, it was raining. The outer bands were coming down. They took plastic bags and cut holes in them and put them on the passengers to get out onto the boat. It was pretty horrible. And to think of actually taking these people, and they'd just gotten dried off and had their first cocktail, the idea of actually putting them back in the boat and sloshing their way back to shore, where there weren't very many. Omo is really just a mud village. He wasn't going to do that. And so, in fact, he lied to the passengers. They thought they were going to wake up and be in the Bay Islands. And then they woke up and they were headed north to drop them off. Anyway.
So going back to the technology and the information that Guy and March had, is it your sense that his source of forecasting knowledge or whatever really just came from his satellite phone, that somebody there at headquarters in Miami Beach was feeding him the information, or did he have some direct access to data that, like you would have on a ship now, some kind of a weather fax at the very least?
He had a weather fax. And he had email. So I think he got, or could have gotten. He must have gotten the forecast from the National Hurricane Center. But that forecast wasn't particularly helpful,
right?
Because it kept saying it's going to bend north, or it's going to go west and then bend north. And so at that point he said, "Well, I'll just go south and get underneath it. And eventually the winds will clock around and be at my back." And that's where I think all this sort of double guessing, second guessing about whether he made the whether he made a mistake or not, um, kind of dissolves, because the storm just, I don't believe this, but a lot of people felt the storm just stalked them, and
Yeah, well, it refused to do what the forecast was predicting. I mean, I remember this very, very well, day after day after day. And I was drawing a cone back then. The Hurricane Center wasn't doing a cone yet, but on television I was putting, and all we had was a big circle all over the Western Caribbean. Yeah, yeah. With kind of leaning a little bit to the north, but I mean the thing was moving at 3 miles an hour or 5 miles an hour. It was crazy. It wasn't, essentially wasn't moving.
Yeah, I think the postmortem, which I just read, was 4. That was the average was 4 miles an hour.
Exactly.
Which is,
yeah.
and that's where Lawrence said he wished he had just said stationary, because if that was the case, you might have. So I'm not sure that WeatherFax gives you a sense. I guess there'd be a visual of it, but it certainly couldn't give you the picture of a satellite picture, which was this enormous storm, which you could see on television, right?
Right.
From the GOES satellites, filling the entire basin.
Right.
And there was no place in it that was you want it to be.
Yeah. It was surprising, though, in Miami. I mean, at headquarters there, they no doubt had the television on. They could see, they could see the coverage that we were doing at that time. Anyway, it's horrifying and disappointing and surprising.
Well, and Jim mentioned a remarkably similar tragedy with 2015's El Faro that sunk. That was Hurricane Joaquin. It's a strikingly similar confluence of a bad forecast and the circumstances around the business, and maybe a misunderstanding of the forecast. These things still happen. I mean, that was 2015. And you mentioned the old time rule of essentially give yourself lots of space. It seems like maybe, I don't know if that's possible in the modern world to go that way, but it seems like that's almost what's necessary to avoid disasters like these. So, Captain March, he was well respected, right? But he was in a really difficult situation. This disaster didn't happen quickly, though. And March made critical decisions about passengers and where they might ride out the storm. Is there one point that stands out as the most critical in sealing the fate of the Fantome?
Yep. It was the decision to leave Roatan. There are many passengers who believe that he saved their life by going to Roatan. That is, in the middle of the night, really with tropical storm conditions around them. He decides to go, I forget what the distance is, 100 miles maybe, to Roatan and drop them off, and the passengers were then flown to Miami, along with all the women. Omoa, as it turns out, was not touched. I mean, there was tidal waves and all of that, but it was not hit by the hurricane. For that matter, neither was Roatan, and at that time, one of the forecasts was it was going to head toward Roatan. But he is sitting there, as he turns out, and finally gets rid of all of the things that are on his mind. And one of his colleagues who looked back on it said, "Look, all the things that are on his mind. He's got the Home Office on the phone. He's got people who are trying to take pictures with him, and he's just wanting to get the hell out of there." And I think I may have said this, but my feeling is that if he had just looked out east and seen this black bar really from horizon to horizon, it took an awful lot of faith in the forecast for him to think that by sneaking down, going closer to the storm, even though it was on his left shoulder as he was sailing that way, that he would actually sail away from the storm. And, I don't have the hindsight. I mean, I do have the hindsight because the storm didn't. But that was the critical point. I think there were people on the guy that was their agent in Omoa, Honduras, said later he could have found buses and he could have found, places for these people to stay. Honduras really took it in the shorts. I mean, 9,000 dead, 9,000 missing. Flooding. I was down. Yeah, a year later when I went there, it was the muds. People were whole villages buried in mud and never found. So the rainfall was horrendous because the storm was sitting there churning up water. But yeah, that's the long answer to your question. I think that was because after that he was at sea. He was at sea, and it was just him and the storm, and he had been in a hurricane on that storm before, but not like this. The sailors talk about being embayed, which is, your back's essentially to the wall and the storm's coming. And what do? Well, it goes to that old rule. Do you go to the sea? If you do you have a good ship? Do you have, a good crew? Do you have time to get out there? Do you have enough motor speed that you can actually get where you want to get before it does? Even if he had gone to Roatan, I mean, he did go to Roatan, which is an island, close, skinny island, that he was going to tack back and forth in the lee of. By the time there were places, because it is the top of a mountain range, there were these gullies, if you will, were incredibly safe. But by the time he got there, the water was roaring over the reefs. There may have been only 40 or 50 foot openings, and you couldn't do that. They didn't have GPS. If you look at their sailing guides, they talk about, well, look at the church on the hill and then put that over here, and then that will guide you in. Well, by the time he got there, it was like foam. So there was no getting into these places, and he hadn't done that. He hadn't taken that big ship. The other possibility is that he could have gone into the neighboring town in the corner there, neighboring country rather, where there was a banana port.
Nicaragua or not Belize?
No. Why am I missing on this? Guatemala.
Oh, right.
In Guatemala, right in the corner of Guatemala was Puerto Barrios, and a big banana port, but it was shallow. He didn't have charts. Now, imagine that you're sailing over there in that area of the country. He did not have charts for that part of the world.
Yeah. So
And
as
he was
always,
unfamiliar.
it's always a confluence, right?
That's right.
Of things. Yeah. And so Mitch was just, one of these epic hurricanes. We experienced Hurricane Andrew in South Florida, same kind of thing. Things happen in Category 5 hurricanes and extreme storms you just don't see in other storms. I was in Tegucigalpa actually in the spring, February-ish, after this happened the previous October. In an area called Esperanza across from the main part of the city. That whole street of houses fell into the Choluteca River, and people scrambled out the front door, and their families were left in the houses that fell in the river. I mean, it was just a horrifying situation that it was the deadliest hurricane in modern time.
Officially, it's never been. Even in the old time, I mean, when it's the 8,000 missing that they can't really account for. Otherwise, you'd have 16, 18,000 people that were killed, and that's as big as it gets.
Yeah, because as you said, that underneath of the whole area where I was, underneath of the mud, because the mud had come out down from the hillside, right, filled up this valley where homes down there that had people in them. And now, when I was there, they were already building, is essentially a squatter's area, building back on the mudslide.
I want to go back and mention one thing. You talk about Max Mayfield, who was the deputy, right, at the National Hurricane Center at the time. I crossed paths with him again, although he doesn't know this. My wife and I moved to New Orleans in August 1st of 2005. She was taking a job at Loyola. We had just moved into Lakeview,
Mm-hmm.
and Max at that time was head of National Hurricane Center. And when he got on the television that Saturday morning and said, "This is the big one,"
Mm-hmm.
knowing Max, I said, "We got to get out of here." So we went back. We drove to Montgomery, where we had come from, Montgomery, Alabama. So no, he was very helpful and welcoming and all of that. And um, you know, anyway, that's off the storm. But
Yeah, Max was a hero of Hurricane Katrina, no question about it.
yeah, no question. Yeah.
So,
So
you talked about Mitch and the mudslides. I guess it set Honduras back, what, 20 years. Just
I think
yeah,
the
that's
president
another
said,
part that's on the back end of the book, after
oh,
kind of during and after what we see going on with the Fantome, but it's a big part of the Hurricane Mitch story, and it's just a very big part of the story, but on the back end of the book. But the part of the book that stuck the most with me was how you describe the absolute fury of the seas when the Fantome is going into the eye wall, and it's unfathomable. I don't think people can really comprehend this. You describe it beautifully, but it's a total hellscape. So, can you describe a little bit, like you do in your book, of what they experienced with the waves? Because everybody thinks of the wind in a Category 5 storm, but it's nothing next to a hurricane whipped ocean as far as the power and the destruction that can come from that.
Luke, if you wouldn't mind, I want to tell you about a paragraph at the beginning of the book that is just the opposite. It's how a storm forms. This to me was quite magical. Now, you guys know all about this, but I'd never known about how the wind starts to ripple the water, and water molecules start coming up. And I just want to read you this because it was one of my favorite as a writer. Uh, so they beginning watching Goes 8 go around, these 4-hour clips. Now I see they're much smoother, but these 4-hour strings are coming together. But they knew that there was some circling going around, so there was organization. That's what they call organization. And so what I write is, to tropical storm analysts, this is a sign of organization, a profane and inadequate word to describe one of nature's most beautiful mysteries, the transformation of chaos into order, of perturbation into cyclone. Atop the counterclockwise whirling of thunderstorms, they detected high cirrus clouds turning clockwise. That vented the air stripped of vapor and heat. And then from there, that dense air fell back and it rushed in over the sea to replace the rising air. And the mechanics were not well understood, nor did organization adequately describe what from Goes 8 resembled a star forming in space out of wild and random weather, warm water, low pressure, a lazily spinning tropical wave. Molecules of air began arranging themselves around a central organizing force. There was an ignition, and a vortex roared to life. It was a birth, really, and a thrill to watch. Hurricane experts live for it. So that's the beginning, right? That's the beginning of this thing. So then you asked what it was like. Oh my God. I go on for pages and pages. My editor and I wrestled over this, as what you do with an editor, is you fight over things. He wanted to always talk about the wind and the rigging, and after a while that gets a little old. So I was more interested in the detail of what was going on. Steve Lyons helped with the creation. Mike Black at the Hurricane Research Center had actually seen what basically is an avalanche coming off of the waves, which like an avalanche in in a 50-foot wave. It's coming down the wave at 25 miles an hour. So, without finding a particular passage, I'll just say people think that in the center of a hurricane, and I have just only been on one on land, which was a Category 1, which was George in Key West. They think it's a sort of peaceful, calm thing. Calm. Well, it's not at sea. You've got this 8 or 10 mile ring of air and water that's moving at the speed of a NASCAR car, right? 180, 200 miles an hour going in a circle. It's shoving water out and away, all the way around, and also moving then. And then you have all of these waves kind of coming inside this thing. And it's not just kind of all coming from one direction. It's coming from, you've got mountain peaks, you've got valleys, you've got square waves, and we're talking waves that minimally probably were 30 feet, probably at times 50. Steve Lyons thinks that occasionally you'd get a 90-footer, if you can imagine, a 90-foot. And they weren't just like nice southern Atlantic waves, which are just big rollers, which I, found in the Atlantic when I crossed in my little boat. They all had, there was water coming off the top. They were, these avalanches were coming down on it. And so there wasn't a dry spot in it. I mean, I've been in tiny little comparison. This was in Europe where we've got Mistrals coming against against a dock, and then it's resonating back at you, and you get these amazingly weird kind of combinations of sails, of waves that your boat is basically corkscrewing, and the props come out of the water. You're tipping over at 45 degrees, and then you're going the other way, and it's chaos, and that's such an inadequate word to describe it as well. But it's and the boat may be making some forward motion, but not likely. And so it's just being, I wouldn't say tossed around would be the way, but it was being shoved around in all kinds of directions. The stern may be being pushed one way, the bow another. It's being tipped. There's water coming over the top of you. It's coming over the bow. And then you've got, if you can imagine, I can't, but water being blown at 200 miles an hour, which is what's happening inside that eye wall. That's worse than a fire. I mean, it'll kill a guy. I mean, and it would break things, and it would, so I wish I probably have a paragraph or two in there that's more concise about it, but I say, and I do remember thinking before the satellite phone quit at 4:30 on the 27th of October, Guy on March reported to Michael Burke that the wind was clocking around behind him. Well, the hurricane guys who looked at that later said this was the air that was coming in to the eye wall. In other words, he thinks he's behind it. He thinks he's in the outer region where in that southwest quadrant where in fact he can sail out and be safe. But it wasn't. It was replacement air, if you will. It was being sucked into the eye wall, and he thought that was safe. Well, all it did was suck him in, and this is probably silly to say, and I use this in the book. But it to me, it felt like, it seemed like, what came to mind was if you had a little plastic, or just ducklings in a gutter, and along comes a street sweeper. I mean, it's that kind of force equal this, hitting this tiny little thing, and there's no surviving it. I guess I don't know I've ever read anyplace else about someone actually being in an eye wall in a boat and surviving. Maybe they have, but
especially in a storm like of that intensity, and also the fact that stationary, it's putting more and more energy into that same part of the ocean from all directions. So Jim, before we let you go, tell us what happened to Windjammer and Michael Burke and Mike Burke and all those folks that were involved.
Well, it was the beginning of the end. They were actually scheduling people who, before the guys were even buried, they were scheduling them on new trips, and a lot of people took them up on it. But that was 1998. Captain Burke, the old man, not too long, I visited him, and he was fine and gave me a great interview. The last interview in the book is him, how he wished he'd been aboard when it happened. But he eventually got a stroke and was being taken care of by his wife, who they had been estranged, but she took care of him. He eventually died in 2013. And then one of his kids had a drug overdose, and another kid died. And Michael went on and stayed in the maritime business, but essentially the company collapsed. And one of the boats, called the Mandalay, one of his other boats, was used by a company for a while because a lot of these jammers wanted to continue the magic of these trips. And a company called Island Windjammers does that, but not with Mike's boats. They have two other boats that they use. Mike's, after he died, the Black Castle, I don't know if you've ever been in it, but it was a weird place. After he sold it for $8 million, burned down. And
Right, I remember, yes.
It's a prime spot there on the bay, but
Yes, it is.
So I think Mike wished he had died on the boat, because otherwise he had to live with it for how many years? 98 to 2013.
15 years.
So, yeah, and so the company went out of business. There are sort of windjammer companies flying in smaller outfits now, and people still miss it. But I think in some ways Mitch did not get the respect it should have because it hit Honduras.
I agree.
A number of people that died. They used to say in the old days, even guys at the Hurricane Center used to call a hurricane in the mid-Atlantic a fish storm, because they think of all that effect was fish. Well, not if you're on a boat out there. But so I wanted to bring that. That's why I spent a lot of time talking about Honduras and what happened there, because I think we Americans, and we are the media giants, and we can control the narrative, if you will, don't have an appreciation. Frankly, Ireland's sent more aid to Honduras after the storm than the United States did, and a lot of churches and that kind of thing did. So, I think Mitch is it's one for the history books. This was just a little tiny story in the midst of it, when you figure all the people who died. But it's also a history book because one for the history books because of what was learned about it and the failure of technology, really, of what we count on and what you guys count on in making your forecasts, and sticking your neck out and saying, well, this is what's going to go here, it's going to go there. And then people depending on that forecast to make life or death decisions. And that's what was done here. And it failed them.
Yeah, Jim, many lessons learned from your book, and it simultaneously serves as a tribute to those that were lost, both on the Fantome and in Honduras and elsewhere in Central America, and as a stark reminder of just how tragic these storms can be, and Mitch certainly was. So we certainly thank you for joining us today. This has been an honor to speak with you. So again, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm honored.
Jim Carrier, author of The Ship in the Storm. It's an interesting and truly sad story.
Beyond imagination, I think, and I really do think that Mitch is something of a forgotten storm. I mean, it was just I don't know. It's hard to describe. It was such an off the charts event in every side from the magnitude of the storm, the strength of the storm, and then what happened. I remember it. I remember I worked every day of that storm, and it was like Mother Nature was conspiring against Honduras when it finally turned to the south. And of course, the Fantome was just caught in this bizarre and frustrating and stunning set of events, because first of all, Mitch just kept intensifying. We never thought it was going to be this super high-end Category 5. And then we kept forecasting it to go to the Gulf. And in South Florida, we were very interested in that because storms come out of the Caribbean and they arc to the east. They go north and arc to the east because of the way that the wind flow is. And we thought that this storm might very well affect Florida once it eventually got into the Gulf, as it drifted there at a few miles per hour. But no computer models said it was going to go south. They said west, they said a little bit north, they said a variety of things, but nothing said it was going to go south. Nothing said it was going to go into Honduras. And obviously that played a part in the loss of the Fantome. And also, of course, Nicaragua was involved. So of the more than 10,000 people that died, 10 to 18,000, somewhere in that range, that died, many were in Nicaragua as well, from just the plain old heavy rain. It was one of those storms, and I agree with Jim that it doesn't get the notice that it deserves for being such an epic event not that long ago.
Yeah, just a staggering loss of life. I believe it's the second deadliest Western Atlantic storm ever. That's known,
and that's counting 1780 as the most, right? So in terms of modern storms, there is nothing really that compares with it. And the second one, by the way, is Fifi from 1954, which hit in the same place. And
more than Galveston, huh?
Kind of did the same thing. Yeah, it killed more than Galveston, yeah. Even the upper limits on the estimates in Galveston, which were about 8,000 or so. Fifi was 10,000.
Wow. Well, Jim talks about the how a lot of the weather balloons and the reporting sites that would have been really helpful with the forecast were down. There was something like 3 out of the 9 were working, but even after they got recon into the storm, the forecast remained pretty rough. So I look at that and I'm curious how it would play out today. We don't know, but
we don't know,
would today's forecast have been much better? Certainly hope so, but we don't know. So anyway, it's a beautifully written book, and I can't recommend it enough. And it's available on Audible too. So for those of you that are like me, you like to listen to your books while you're slogging along on the way to work on I-95, or if you're catching a workout and you like to listen to it, well, there you go. You can check it out there.
Yeah, a great book, great author for sure. And next week, we have another great guy, not an author, but Dr. Louis Cellini is going to be here with us. Of course, Louis is the director of the National Weather Service and has been at the top of the weather enterprise in the United States for many years, and has stories and has done research and has his name on all variety of things, because he has had such an impact on everything that we do here in the U.S. With weather. And Louis is retiring at the beginning of next year, so I thought this would be a great time to have Louis back on and talk about his career and where the National Weather Service is now and where it's going in the future as he hands it off to his successor. So Dr. Louis Cellini, you'll be here on the podcast next week. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast on your Apple or Android apps, and you get notified if a new podcast is online or when it's online. And of course, you can watch Twitter or Facebook as well, and I'll let you know there. And if you want to see a video version of this podcast or any of them, go to local10.com/hurricane and look on the right side of the page. So for now, for Luke Dorris, I'm Bryan Norcross. Stay safe, be well, and we'll see you here next week.